So, welcome. Today we're really lucky to be joined by Mick Cooper. Hello, Mick.
Hi, Giles.
Mick is an internationally acclaimed author, trainer, and consultant. Mick is also a practicing counselling psychologist and a professor of counselling psychology at the University of Roehampton. He's also the director of CREST, which is the Centre for Social and Psychological Transformation at Roehampton University. But what really interests me as well is that Mick was the lead author of the recent Ethos study, which stands for the Effectiveness and Cost-Effectiveness Trial of Humanistic Counselling in Schools. The Ethos study is one of the largest research projects ever undertaken to look at the effectiveness of humanistic counselling in schools. And Mick has kindly agreed to be interviewed today for our student magazine to talk about this research and to look at research in counselling and psychotherapy for students. So I wonder first, Mick, if you could just give our members a brief overview of the Ethos study.
Yeah, so what we did in Ethos was that we were looking at the effectiveness of humanistic, person-centered, really, school counselling. And the way that we did that is that we were based in 18 schools, and we had about 329 young people involved in the study, and half of them received counselling on top of their usual pastoral care, and then the other half just had the pastoral care, and then later on they were able to access counselling if they wanted to. And what we looked at really was whether the ones who'd had counselling, whether their mental well-being improved, whether their psychological distress reduced, whether they felt better about themselves. Halfway through the counselling, so about 6 weeks. At the end of counselling, so around 12 weeks, and then another 12 weeks later. We also looked at the cost of the counselling and how it worked out economically. Mm-hmm. So as you were saying, Charles, it was the biggest study that's been done. I mean, these are expensive studies. It was cost over £800,000 yeah, it's quite a lot to look at these. To look at these processes. Yeah, so we looked at the effectiveness of the intervention for kids of that age.
I think one of the things which will probably be a surprise to our members is the cost of actually doing research, because that certainly raised my eyebrows, how much it costs to do these things.
Well, it does, because you're paying for the researchers, you're paying for the counsellors, you're paying for a trials unit who collects all the data and process all the data. So there was hundreds of people involved in the study, let alone the clients. I mean, these are big. They're not frequent, these kind of big studies that get the funding to look at it at that level. But you need that level of kind of input robustness to really look at these things in depth in a way that you can't do without that kind of level of funding.
Which I think also is what probably makes the research so important, but it's probably not going to happen again to that level for a while.
It's probably not. It's probably not. That's a very good point. It's probably not.
So how could students use this research to inform their studies and practice? How can it be utilised?
Okay, well, in terms of their own research, I'd certainly encourage people to have a look at it. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if we want to talk about the results, Giles, but in terms of looking at the results and thinking about what was found in the study, I think would be interesting. There's going to be qualitative elements coming out of it as well as the quantitative element. So interviews and what came out of the interviews with the young people. And there's lots that people can kind of follow up on. Maybe we talk about the results first, and then we can go on to look at, what comes out of it in terms of practice.
So I suppose on results, did it give you the results you were expecting, or did it go in a different direction?
Yeah, it was. I mean, the results were a bit disappointing from a counselling perspective. What we found is that the counselling did bring about significant improvements in well-being by the end on our main measure, the young person's core psychological distress. So there were significant reductions, meaning that they weren't just by kind of random chance by the end of counselling, and that follow-up. And also in the middle of counselling, but they weren't large reductions. They were kind of fairly small. And in terms of cost effectiveness, we didn't see any cost savings for the counselling, which means that the amount that the counselling costs a certain amount, And then that wasn't recouped. There weren't savings. For instance, the young people who had the counselling weren't going to their GP less, or seeing their teachers less. So it came at a cost, the counselling. So it was a little bit disappointing in some ways. But the good news was that, from a counselling perspective, is that the gains that the young people had was sustained 3 months after the end of the counselling, which was really encouraging to see. And then on some of the indicators like self-esteem, the young people did really well. And when we looked at their kind of personal goals, so the specific things that they come to counselling for, then we saw really large improvements in the ones that had counselling as opposed to the ones who hadn't. So it kind of depended on what you were looking at. When we were looking at things like symptoms of depression and anxiety, we didn't see much change from the ones who had counselling to the ones who didn't. But then not that many of the kids actually said that what they wanted from the counselling was to reduce depression. So it's a fairly crude indicator. Probably the best indicator is actually what the young people specifically wanted from counselling. And there it was very encouraging results.
Because I know there's, this may be extrapolating too much information out of it, but, I've seen data that 75% of mental health issues are formed before someone turns 18. And I've seen research saying that if we can invest in counselling and other interventions in the young people's mental health early on, the cost savings may not be immediate, but over a lifetime, they can be huge.
It may be. The problem is that as a counsellor myself, you're involved at NCS, as counsellor, we do have an investment in reading the data in a particular way. And, we're not the most objective people. And that's why these kind of big, robust studies where, for instance, things like even the statistician, when he analysed the data, he didn't know which one were the ones who had counselling and which were the ones who didn't until right at the end, like the reveal, so that he couldn't be biased in his analysis. So, the study, with something like the cost, I'd certainly like to think that the savings that you get have a long-term impact, and hopefully they do, but you kind of need to research it. There's very little research on that. There's no evidence. The problem with a study like that is it would mean having some kids having counselling, some kids never having a counselling, and then seeing what the impact is. So, we hear stories, and certainly I'm sure counsellors out there will have worked with people who've come back and said, years later, it really changed my life. And we see that. But, people's lives are changed by other things like reading a book, watching a film, talking to a friend. Whether it's a kind of effective and efficient way of doing it, we'd love to think so. But the reality is we kind of don't know.
And I suppose, as you say, if it costs, 800,000 to do the ethos study, if you're trying to do a longitudinal, long-term study looking at people over 10 or 15 years, that's not going to happen, is it?
Yeah, and it's not going to happen. But it's more, the problem is that how do you'd have to kind of stop people having counselling. If you want to see what the effects of counselling are, you'd have to stop half of the people not having counselling. Nobody would want to do that. When we first did these studies, we were very wary of allocating people to a no counselling arm. And we only did it for kind of 6 weeks before we then gave them counselling. But we realised actually that for a lot of the kids, that when they were allocated to a waiting list, effectively, they were okay about that, and they were just pleased that they were going to get something at some point in time. So we extended it ultimately 6 months, but I don't think we would have wanted to go beyond that. So when you talk about follow-up longer term outcomes, it's difficult because it's difficult to have the methodology to do that without kind of raising some more ethical problems.
And then sort of looking at research, is there any way students can contribute to this type of research?
Can they copy?
Can they contribute?
Well, the data is all available, and so people can get in touch with me and that they can analyze the data. They may not want to analyze the statistical data, but we have interviews with 50 of the young people. We've got interviews with parents, carers. We've got interviews with teachers. We've got the interviews of a number of the sessions. So potentially there's the possibility of analysing that data. There's a lot of data there that, say, if you're doing a master's or even an undergraduate project, potentially, probably through the teachers on your own courses, you can access the data and do analyses. We've done some of the analyses, but there's so many more analyses to do, looking at what the young people said, for instance, about empathy, or what they said about trust, how they found the silences was very interesting, and maybe we'll talk about that. Yeah, there's a real wealth of data that we're hoping that people will use that. I mean, one of the things that I find frustrating is sometimes when counsellors do research, it tends to be very internally focused. So it's about counsellors' experiences of maybe being empathic, or counsellors' experiences of, you know, charging for sessions. How do counsellors feel about that? And, you know, those are interesting topics and important, but there's so much out there about clients and learning about how clients experience counselling. I think there's an awful lot that we can learn from clients' experiences, and we have that data. We have 50 young people talking about what it was like going through counselling, both the ones who really liked it and some who didn't like it. And there's things that we can learn there, and there's things that can help shape and guide our practice. You know, going on to the question you're asking, Charles, about what can we learn from practice. So what we found and these were counsellors who were experienced, qualified, person-centered counsellors who had additional training person-centered. So they were good person-centered counsellors. But what we found, for instance, is that about 20% or so of the young people said that they didn't like the silences.
Right.
They felt there were too many silences, that they felt they were awkward, they were uncomfortable. Similar amount said that they wished the counsellors had used been a bit more active, like offered strategies or techniques and advice, some guidance. So I think there's some important things there to listen to, and both as an individual counsellor, if you're working in a school, but also for the field to listen to, the field of person-centered counselling, and to think, well, how do we train our counsellors so that they can be really empathic in a way which also understands when a client is uncomfortable, for instance. And I'm sure the counsellors in our trial were, you know, where they were silent, it's because they were wanting to be non-directive, because they wanted to be empathic, because they wanted to listen, because they wanted to give the young person space. And certainly the young people loved that. I mean, the thing that they liked most was feeling listened to. Yeah. So it's not that the person-centered counselling was wrong, but it was just, I think there's things that we could learn as a field about how best to give an effective intervention, how most to help young people. And I personally, I think that means sometimes with some young people being a bit more, using more methods, techniques, strategies, things like relaxation exercises. A lot of the kids love learning about relaxation exercises.
I suppose it's being willing to be directed when needed, and to give the interventions which one thinks would needed. I suppose also what you're saying, but it's making sure all children or all people are unique. So try and say one form, one style, one type of counselling works for all is yeah.
Well, that's what person-centered, you know, we all have different understandings of person-centered. For me, person-centered means starting from the point that different clients need different things at different points in time. And I don't know until I met somebody what it is that they need. And some of the kids really thrive from a more non-directive style. But certainly it was the case that for some of the young people, they were saying that they wanted more, or they wanted something more input. Now, of course, you can only work within your areas of practice, and you know, if you're doing a course in non-directive counselling and that's what you're learning, you can't go off and start doing CBT. But I think you can be at least aware of those things and talk with a young person about maybe they need some additional support if that's available. And as I say, I think as a field, what ethos has taught us is that I think the field of person-centered counselling needs to think a bit more about how do we integrate more strategic methods into our trainings without compromising the basic principles of a kind of listening, empathy, space. And for me, you know, using some of these strategies like, for instance, teaching relaxation exercises or kind of maybe more structured methods, he's been very person-centered because that's what the young person want. So, you know, people say, oh, it's not person-centered to ask questions, but a lot of the kids love questions. And that makes it person-centered to me. You know, if a kid is saying, it'd be really helpful for me to have some methods, and the counsellor is saying, I'm sorry, I can't do that because, you know, I don't do that. You know, or if they have those skills and it's kind of withholding them, I can't see how that's person-centered.
No, I couldn't agree more. And I think the other thing which is interesting from this conversation is the ethos study has given a wealth of information which is going to be there for people to access for, you know, a long time to come, to take out that information and analyze it and look at all the different sections and areas. I suppose that another question I'd ask is, because the studying and research is so important, I think, And as you're saying, there hasn't necessarily been enough on things like the client voice. How can students, get into and undertake research for counselling and psychotherapy?
Yeah, well, I think it's very difficult to do it if you're not on a program. So I think, normally the research will be done on a master's or an undergraduate program or a doctoral program. And that's probably the right place to do it, where you've got that supervision. So I don't think people should just kind of be going off and doing it if they're in private practice just on their own, because it does need some support, and there's ethical issues and ethical boards that you need to go through and work with. But I think that where you are doing what I would say is, if you're on a program where you're required to do some kind of research element, do something that is meaningful and that can contribute to the field. Don't just do it as an academic exercise where, because you have to do it. There's so much we can learn, Giles. There's so much that we can learn about clients' experiences. So if you're able, for instance, to interview 8 clients maybe who have had, I don't know, person-centered or Gestalt therapy or TA for maybe anxiety or depression, and obviously going through all the ethical safeguards that you need to go through. But talk to clients, find out, ask them. John McLeod and I did a paper in 2015 on something called Client Helpfulness Interview Studies, which are really simple studies. Just go and ask people what was helpful in your therapy, what wasn't helpful. And I think if we can build up understandings of what clients say is helpful and unhelpful, then that would really help us guide our practice more in a more person-centered, more client-centered way. Listen to recordings, do case studies. There's lots of good methods. John McLeod, again, has written about case study methods where you can track clients and asking really open questions. I think part of it, Giles, is research is best when it's a really open question. And often the problem is people go in and they say, right, I want to show this. And, in a sense, that's what we did in Ethos. We wanted to show something, but it's not really the best research. The best research is when you go in with a question you don't know the answer to. That's something I often say to my students, not what is the question that you want to prove, but what is the question you don't know the answer to, but would really like to find out. So that might be something like, one of the studies I'm doing at the moment is clients' experiences of working with preferences. Like, do they like being asked about their preferences? Do their preferences change over therapy? What kind of preference do they have? And it's been fascinating interviewing clients, asking them about that, and then analyzing it. And of course, what you end up with is a very complex, rich body of data. You don't get everybody saying, wow, preferences are amazing or preferences are terrible. It's always a complex picture. But through that analysis, you can begin to see patterns and things that can then inform practice. There's so many things, self-disclosure, interpretations, all these things. Even if you're just doing a small study, even if you're just talking to 2 or 3 clients, even if you're talking to your mates, if you get that through an ethics board, and asking them about their experiences, asking people about their experiences of therapy, and what I think, just that very basic question: what worked for you and what didn't work for you. I think there's so much we can learn there.
And I think you're right, we often don't necessarily listen to a client's voice enough, perhaps. But I did have another question for you. What mistakes can students make when they're doing research? But I read something you wrote, Mick, which is very interesting, that sometimes people don't formulate their plan for research enough. So when they come to think, oh, who's going to be my group I'm going to ask the questions to, they find out they've got no one to ask the questions to.
It's got to be feasible. If you have a look at mick-cooper.co.uk, there's lots of pointers around doing research that you might be interested in. And certainly that is a problem, when people don't, you don't plan, and you got to think from the start, how can I access people? It's no good thinking I'm going to do an interview study about people who are in prison for so-and-so, if actually you're never going to get access. Something you might have a way in, and that's great. So I think that is one definite one about not being able to access. The other one, as I was saying, one is kind of just being very internally focused rather than, I think, actually engaging with the field. I think there's an important balance to be struck between choosing a project that you're interested in, but also choosing something the field is interested in. Yeah. You might have had a session and you kind of made a cup of tea for a client, and it was the kind of open everything. So you think, I want to do a research project on what it's like making tea for clients, but you kind of need to have a look at the field and say, is anybody else asking these questions? Because I think counsellors can get really hung up on, when you're doing research, I must do something original. It must be something that nobody else has asked. And actually, where you can build on knowledge is by taking what other people have done and actually looking at that and maybe modifying it. You know, so maybe somebody's already done a study on coffee, and then you think, right, okay, let's look at tea. Let's look if it's similar answers. Or somebody's done, say, a quantitative study looking at therapists' experience of self-disclosure. So you want to do that qualitatively, or you want to do it qualitatively with clients. So kind of looking outwards as well as looking inwards, looking at the field, looking at what the questions there are there, and building on that and saying, right, well, given that all this has been done, what can I do? That, of course, is of interesting to me, but it's also going to be of interest to other people. The fact that something is intuitively, deeply interesting to you doesn't necessarily mean other people are going to be interested in it. And you just end up with this field of, like, you know, somebody's done something on coffee and somebody's done something on tying their shoelaces, and, you know, all these kind of mishmash of things. If everybody in the council, I mean, I do believe this, if everyone in the counselling field in master's or doctoral level was doing research projects that were actually about what clients found helpful and unhelpful, and we're also looking at the effects and the impact of counselling, I think we would be way, way farther ahead in terms of having developed effective practices and being able to show that what counsellors do, and having good evidence, both improving the practice and also having that evidence of what we do is helpful. And so for me, there's a frustration that often counsellors say, you know, well, why are services getting decommissioned? Why aren't there jobs for counsellors? And a lot of that is to do because there isn't the evidence. And why isn't there the evidence? Well, it's partly because counsellors themselves aren't working to build that evidence. There isn't a big body of people out there who are going to do all this research for us. If we want to develop the evidence, you, me, people watching this video have a responsibility to generate it, and that's, you know, in the ways that we're discussing, but no one else is going to do it for us.
Well, I would say there's absolutely no doubt, Mick, your passion for research.
That's a nice way of putting a rant. You're passionate.
No, it is.
I am. I'm frustrated. I'm passionate and I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated because I just think if all that energy was used in a really constructive way, it could just do so much, and you know, so much of it I feel gets turned inwards, and for good reason. You know, counsellors are interested in themselves, they want to look at themselves, but I just find clients so much more interesting than myself. I'm not very interesting.
Well, I think then I did have a question of how can counsellors and psychotherapists develop a career in research, but I think it's probably to join a university or a charity.
Yeah, it's very difficult to do. I mean, if you're really serious about a career in research, you would normally do a master's in research, and then there's a potential for doing a PhD. There's not much funding for that, so often that has to be self-funded, which is a real shame, and it introduces kind of inequalities there. Or there's sometimes some research jobs, you almost certainly would need a master's for that, but there really aren't many in the counselling psychotherapy field. Sometimes people come in and they get teaching jobs, and then as part of a teaching job at university that they could then do some research. I mean, there's a massive need for researchers in counselling psychotherapy. The numbers of kind of active counselling psychotherapy researchers in the UK, you could almost count on your hands, toes and fingers maybe, but it's not many. And that puts the profession at risk. It's got to be said, it puts the profession at risk, because the funders, the commissioners, you know, they don't say, well, when they're thinking about what to fund, they don't say, well, I wonder what Carl Rogers wrote in 1957, or what did Freud say about what was effective in 1902. What they say is, what is the latest evidence on what is effective? And if people aren't generating evidence for counselling, like with the Ethos trial and other studies and Michael Barkin's practice trial, if there isn't a body of evidence evolving and emerging and improving, then it puts the field really at risk. It really does. Or it leaves it being something which is just kind of very marginalized, and, you know, some people do kind of in the voluntary sector, or people do it, you know, a bit like I was, you know, like kind of crystal healing or something like that. That's a risk that if there's no evidence, it's seen in the same way as something where there's very little. There's probably a massive body of evidence of crystal healing. I don't know it, and I'm sure lots of people really believe in it. But you know, most people are skeptical because there just isn't much evidence. There's evidence for acupuncture. That's a good one.
Well, I suppose then really we're coming to the end of our time today. It's really, I suppose, it's a shout out to students on counselling and psychotherapy who are doing masters or doctorates to really look at research and look at what they can do to really think about what research is going to be and what the benefit is going to be to the
what impact it has, Charles. Yeah, what impact, but also, so it's a shout out to them, but also to the trainers. You know, don't see the research component of your courses as a kind of add-on that you have to do. Think about how you can work with the students to do stuff that is useful and that is going to contribute to the field, because someone's got to do it. And if you're in that position where you're running these research modules, you know, you could have, like, for instance, you can have, if you got a group of 10 undergraduate students, if they all took something like the ethos data and they looked at all the, you know, they worked together analysing the cases where maybe the counselling hadn't been helpful, that could really help us to understand what's going on in those counselling or other, you know, other data sets or interviews with clients. But yeah, to really think, what can I do that is helpful, not just how can I do that as an academic exercise because I have to do it. So it's partly about taking research seriously. One more thing, Charles, can I say one more rant? One more rant. I think one of the problems in our field and what restricts research is modalities and the fact that we're so modality specific. Because if trainings are based on, this is the person-centered model based on what Carl Rogers said in 1957. This is psychodynamic model, and that tends to be a little bit more updated sometimes, but sometimes it's not. You know, but if you've got a training which is based around a specific modality, this is Gestalt therapy based on pearls or more recent pearls, but it makes it really difficult then to take research seriously because, you know, either the research is there, either it confirms what Rogers said in 1957, fantastic, or it disconfirms it and you don't want to particularly pay attention to it. The problem is it doesn't allow you to evolve the approaches. Part of the reason that CBT has been so successful is because it's been a kind of loose set of ideas that has used evidence, drawn evidence. It's evolved, it's developed, it's found out what's helpful, it's changed. There's new ones evolving like, you know, ACT and DBT and all these new things, use evidence, develop evidence, compassion-focused therapy. They're the kind of these loose frameworks that are open to the evidence. And it's ironic that approaches like person-centered therapy have become so fixed on a kind of model of practice that was developed, ironically, based on the evidence 60 years ago. So I think that there's something endemic in our field. I think it is partly about, you know, when we talk about trainers thinking about the impact of the research, I think that can only happen if they're able to be open about the model. You know, that's where the kind of pluralistic ideas come in. And because I think whilst you've got a very kind of fixed, rigid, this is what effective therapy looks like. And of course, you need something consistent in your training. But to the extent that the model is fixed, it's going to be closed, I think, to research. So taking research seriously, not as the only way of informing practice, there's lots of things that inform practice, but to take research seriously means we need to be a little bit more fluid in our models. Rant over, Giles. Thank you very much.
When you do research, you'll have an open mind.
You gotta, and but that means a genuinely open mind, and that's actually really challenging. You know, I find that, you know, if I see a paper that says pluralistic therapy isn't helpful, I go, oh, I don't want to know about this. You know, I don't want to know about it. I want to see the research. But then, you know, so it's an emotional challenge to have an open mind about these things. And, you know, but then as counselors, we should be good at that because our work is about reflecting and recognizing our biases and assumptions and putting that to one side and being open to what is there. That's what we're encouraging our clients to do all the time. So we need to do that as well.
Well, Mick, thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for sharing your passion, I think, as well, as I said earlier, and hopefully it'll inspire some of the students who are listening to this to get further involved in research.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.